Hi everyone, my name is Ali Umamoto and I am a current intern at the Japanese Culture and Community Center of Northern California, or also known as the Center. This is the second and the last webinar that I'm organizing centered on coping with the stress of COVID-19 and mental wellness. This one will be more focused on how we can help and support our family and friends who are struggling with the stress and uncertainties of the pandemic. So for this webinar, we are grateful to have Dr. Kayoko Yokoyama presenting today. So to provide you a little background on our wonderful presenter, she is a licensed psychologist in private practice, serving a wide spectrum of individuals, including women, immigrants, and people of color, through a strength and evidence-based approach with consideration of socio-political dynamics, systemic oppression, and collective trauma. She is a former professor of clinical psychology at JFK University, and after 16 years in that role, she now serves as Adjunct Faculty at JFK University in Pleasant Hill, and as well as the Wright University in Berkeley, California. Her interests include feminist therapy, social justice training, and women's issues, including body image and mothering. She also served for 5 years as the Director of SunVision Workshops, which is a cultural and educational program for elder care professionals from Japan to learn about the psychosocial care of older adults in the US. So along with all that other educational experience, she also has been a fellow of the Minority Fellowship Program of the American Psychological Association. She has completed her pre-doctoral training at UC Davis. She had gained her postdoctoral training at USF, received her master's degree from psychological counseling from Teachers College, Columbia University, and also has her PhD from counseling psychology from Arizona State University. So definitely a mouthful, and shows just how well educated Dr. Yokoyama is. She was born in Tokyo, Japan, and brings her bicultural, international, and feminist perspectives to her teaching, mentoring, clinical work, and advocacy. So we are so happy she can join us today. So we're glad all of you can be with us here today to discuss and learn about this important topic. This event will be structured starting with a presentation from Dr. Yokoyama, and then we'll have an interactive discussion and Q&A session. At that time, Dr. Yokoyama will ask all of you to turn on your videos and audios, and at the time, me and Haruko will actually make all of you guys panelists so you guys can use the video and audio features on Zoom. So it will kick you out and then it will join you, so just bear with us while we do that. We also have Haruka, who is the Senior Programs Manager for the Center, and he will be here to support us through any technical difficulties that may arise. So throughout the presentation, type any questions you might have in the chat box so you don't forget, and Dr. Yama can address your question. She'll also, I believe, be asking questions throughout. So be prepared to participate throughout. So again, we are happy all of you can make it with us today at this webinar, and I will now let Dr. Yokoyama take it away.
Thank you so much, Ali. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with everyone, so I hope you'll be able to see it. Okay. All right, so please stop me and let me know. Sometimes talking into Zoom, you're like never sure if there are people out there who can actually understand what you're saying. But I'm really happy to be here today with everybody and really honored to do this talk. So we'll talk about helping family and friends cope with stress in the age of COVID. It's been a few months now, and so I know it's been challenging times for a lot of people. And I guess one of the first things I wanted to talk about was just common reactions. You know, I think it's quite common for the last few months to experience disappointment and grief, missed gatherings and events. And it's really, you know, giving the message to the people around us. It's really okay not to be okay sometimes. That we all have a lot going on, and also a lot that's all of a sudden changed. You know, most of us have never experienced a pandemic, and so the implications are so wide-reaching. And so just bringing that compassion and understanding for ourselves that we're grieving some of these losses. So I was just wanted to ask everybody just to start, see if I can do this. Just a quick little question about sorry, it's to type and talk at the same time. So I know, we're sheltering in place, we're much more restricted, but I'm just wondering if some of you want to write one fun thing that you've been able to do despite all of this with your friends or family, something that you really enjoyed just doing with the people in your life, your loved ones. So I put it in the chat box, I hope. Let me know if you can't see it. Car lunch. Okay. Outdoor picnic. Going for walks along the ocean and lakes. Taking walks. Beautiful. My parents' this beach trip, my parents' sister and I were able to shelter in place together for 2 months for the first time in 10 to 11 years. So some of that togetherness has been welcome, sweet. Walks and hikes, Google Hangout with nieces, hiking and walking, Pose watch party with the family. Great, beautiful. Walking the dog and recording data. Love it. I'm not sure what recording data is, so I'll have to follow up during the Q&A. I guess the next question I'm worrying about, online graduation. Yes. I'm just wondering, what events have you missed out on? What are some of the events that were supposed to happen that didn't happen in your lives? Give you a moment with that. If you've missed any daughter's in-person prom, Trans-Canadian Railroad trip, basketball tournament, celebrating my grandpa's 98th birthday as a family, summer school, visit my sister's medical school graduation, trip to Barcelona and other international travel, spring break plans, attending NCAA swim championships. Wow. There are a lot of ways in which I think people all around us are grieving so much of what's been lost. Attending NCAA swim championships, visiting friends' new house in Vermont. So all these things are things that we collectively are grieving, things that we've missed out on. I know I've missed out on seeing family members. I've had TAs who have, were planning weddings, friends who were planning baby showers, lots of things. So disappointment and grief is okay. It's common and it's expected when our lives change so suddenly. Common reactions to, this sudden situation since March: fear of getting sick, unemployment, financial concerns, unknown future, social isolation, or upset about new restrictions. It's hard not to be able to do the things that we had anticipated doing in the spring and the summer. And of course, for so many people, it may be us, and it may also be our loved ones, people we know, our friends and family members who are dealing with unemployment, underemployment, furloughs, and also just an uncertain future, what will be next year, the following year. And of course, everyone is quite isolated, right? So we're not able to see people as much, even just walking down the street or going to the supermarket or going to the post office, all these things that we took for granted, perhaps. we're much more isolated. We're much more likely to think about whether we're going to do all these things. So there's stress and changes in energy and changes in sleep. And, you know, I think we want to watch among our loved ones for these kinds of changes. So I think some of these changes can be common, right? So I think a little stress, some change in energy, even some changes in sleep is, you know, I think a common reaction that a lot of people are having. I think productivity is also really shifted for a lot of people. So changes in concentration, we have a lot on our minds right now. And so just kind of allowing for that, but also watching among our loved ones. Is it something that's really interfering, right? So the stress or change in energy, change in sleep, is it really interfering with everyday life? So whether that's school, work, we want to watch out for those things. We also have new social stressors in decision making. So I know that I have talked with my own friends, my own family members, people in my community, as well as seeing it in my clinical practice, these new social stressors in decision making. So just how do we make decisions about physically distancing? You know, many of us have probably heard in the news, read in the paper, read online, all the things we're supposed to be doing, but where do we draw our own line? What kinds of situations feel safe for us? What kinds of invitations feel okay? I've talked to a lot of people about invitations that they weren't able to accept because they felt like, you know, I know that my friends are doing that, but I'm not so comfortable doing that. And how do we then communicate with friends and family about those kinds of invitations? These are all new social stressors that we're dealing with and new ways that we're making decisions. This is important, you know, behind the scenes. A lot of times, you know, I've heard a lot of different kinds of conversations and people are making a lot of judgments about, you know, well, you know, people should make this decision or that decision, or that's the wrong way to go about things. And so we have a lot of feelings about what's happening. And there may be a lot of things that we also don't understand. You know, so I've heard some people say, oh, I think we're overreacting. Oh, you know, I think it's really okay. And there may be also visible and invisible disabilities that are maybe not part of our understanding or awareness, underlying and existing health conditions, addiction or domestic violence. You know, I think if you're witnessing, you know, among your friends and family, situations that involve conflict or addiction, a lot of those things can really exacerbate in times like this, especially with sheltering in place. And so we really want to watch out for signs of that. Caregiving responsibilities for vulnerable others. So there are a lot of caregivers out there who are under even more stress. Of course, some of the you know, assisted living facilities, nursing homes have had high rates of COVID, and of course, such a highly vulnerable population. Child and elder abuse, you know, those are things that we want to be watching out for in our friends and family. Are they safe? And these are all things that can get exacerbated. And so I think being a friend and ally to your, you know, friends and family members when they need help. There's a lot on this slide. Young children and trying to shelter in place. We could probably have long discussions on each of these. But of course, you know, families with young children especially, very, very hard right now as children are not in schools, children are not in daycare, and so the onus often falls on the parents who are home. And I have to say, oftentimes the mother who is at home, who may be juggling a job, may be juggling other things, caregiving, who is out working and who has the privilege to work from home. So, you know, that is a whole system of inequity that we're seeing play out right now in our culture and society. But of course, you know, if you are able to stay home, that is of course a privilege compared to those who don't have that choice. who has enough space, who has enough access to Wi-Fi. You know, we talk about children or people working, you know, working and schooling from home, but of course all of that is contingent on Wi-Fi access, as well as just space. You know, does each individual have the space they need to do their work? Who is living alone or more isolated? I know, you know, who's undocumented, who's homeless. Those are all, you know, risk factors in our situation right now. And, you know, I know international students at universities are feeling very vulnerable given some of the recent policies. And COVID is making all of that worse, right? It's really exacerbating things even more. There are also those who have been recently unemployed, underemployed, or furloughed. So a lot of people have had job status changes. And so how do we honor and support with a lot of compassion the people around us who are going through lots of changes and challenges? Okay, spent enough time on this slide. Friends and family. So some of you may also have family and friends who have had COVID, who have COVID now. And of course, there's a lot of, you know, in some communities, maybe more than others, judgment and stigma around what that means. I've certainly heard, you know, people say, oh, well, you know, they deserve to get it because they were doing this and that. But of course, no one deserves to get COVID. And so there may be a lot of tension around disclosing and a lot of decisions, you know, ethical as well as sort of relational decisions that people are making about how they disclose, and then all the feelings that are related to that. And of course, there's all sorts of social inequities associated with COVID that many of you may have read about. We're all reading and watching the news. There's a lot happening right now. And it's very important, I think, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, but maybe even still, a lot of people are really tuned into the news. And while we all want to be informed, up to date, understanding the science and the current policies that are going on, current new sort of mandates about how we should be physically distancing and masking up, we want to keep up on that, but there's also a fine line where we can also, I really learned this term during this pandemic, news poisoning, that we can really affect our own wellness and mental health when we are so tuned into the news that it really is becoming toxic to our well-being. And so some people are also on a lot of social media, and so just really watching how our friends and family members are consuming media. And also really, you know, some media literacy around, you know, are we consuming good media? And, you know, media that is, you know, accurate, I think is an important, you know, thing to try to teach younger children as well, if, you know, if in families, something to think about. I'm just watching the time here, making sure I'm on time here. Okay. So Asian American racism. So with the Black Lives Matter and the social unrest that we've been witnessing, I've definitely talked to a lot of people who feel traumatized and re-traumatized from what's going on in terms of racism. And so that's something that we want to also watch for in our friends and family in terms of consuming the news, and also what does it mean to be a citizen today? You know, how are people taking that up? What, you know, are people, you know, in our circles protesting or not? What does that mean? And for some people, it's bringing up, you know, I've definitely talked to Asian Americans, Japanese Americans, who have talked about how some of the earlier traumas that they've experienced are coming up again now. So it's been called the racism pandemic. That may be, you know, familiar to some of you and new to some of you, but that we're sort of dealing with a double pandemic right now. So how do we feel about what we're seeing? How are our communities affected? who are we as a Japanese American community in terms of those of us who are monoracial, those of us who are mixed? What does that mean to us given this racism pandemic? We just talked about the re-traumatizing component for a lot of individuals. Let's see, and I wrote, who are we as a monoracial and mixed race families? How are we affected individually in our families? So I think the question is, how are we talking about this in our families? How does that affect us in terms of our own wellness? Those are important things to talk about. And, you know, it's hard to avoid. But I think for those who are new to thinking about race and racism, you know, a lot of times people think, oh, I shouldn't talk about this with my children because I don't want to upset them. And, you know, or maybe if I'm quiet about it, they won't know I'll be able to protect their innocence. And we now know that children, even babies, recognize race. We used to say 3 years old, but there's actually more research now that says that it's actually just a few months old that babies can actually begin to recognize some of these racial differences, you know, even under a year old. So I do think that it's very important for us to talk with our friends and families, but also our children, right, about what's going on in the world. It really helps them cope with it, and so that it's sort of normalized, right? That it's not something to fear, but it's also something that we can, you know, work collectively together in our communities. Okay. So as a psychologist, you know, one of the things I think about is complex trauma. Part of what we're dealing with right now is you know, there are so many traumatic things that could be happening to individuals and communities, and each person responds to it in very different ways. And for some people who have experienced multiple and long-term exposure to traumas, and also, you know, thinking about, so this time may be particularly vulnerable kind of time for individuals, and then also repetitive, prolonged, and cumulative. So what's happening now with the pandemic is it's pretty long term, right? It's not just a one-time incident. We're dealing with this new COVID pandemic on a daily basis. We sort of confront it all the time. You know, I know one of the things we say in my family is we say, oh, don't forget your mask, don't forget your hand sanitizer. And, you know, this is a new thing. We weren't talking about that in, you know, January or February, but our realities have changed. And so it's not to say that, you know, having to use hand sanitizer is a complex trauma. What I'm referring to is really the ways in which, for some people who have underlying psychological struggles, for example, anxiety, it can really come out during times like this, and to be exposed repeatedly to something that is traumatic is really a hardship for some individuals more than others. And there are also some developmentally vulnerable periods, you know, that are important to consider. So for a lot of people dealing with transitions and changes, you know, those are vulnerable, potentially vulnerable periods. Okay, so I wanted to show a quick little video, and I have to make sure I'm on time before I show this film. I think it's okay. I'm gonna show it. Let's see. Thanks for your patience as I switch here. Okay.
I'm basically an NIH and NIMH lifer.
Dr. Richard Nakamura now directs the NIH's Center for Scientific Review, where all incoming grant applications undergo initial evaluation. But for the first 33 years of his NIH career, Dr. Nakamura served in the National Institute of Mental Health. He eventually rose to the post of Deputy Director, Acting Director, and Scientific Director. On the occasion of Minority Mental Health Month, Dr. Nakamura recently confided how his own family coped with an endemic mental illness, a history intertwined with an immigrant community's struggles during the social and economic turmoil of 20th century America.
Even though this is painful, I like to tell this story because mental illnesses are so stigmatized in our society, and particularly in the Asian community. Let me go back to my grandfather, who came from Japan at the turn of the century. He settled in the Yakima Valley, was one of the first leaseholders there. Started as a complete desert, they turned it into a garden. Their success was such that there came to be resentment. The Japanese Americans within the valley were forced out. They ultimately moved to California. So my grandfather, with at that time 4 children and a spouse, moved to California, where they resumed farming in a somewhat friendlier climate. However, partly because of some of the things he went through, and perhaps because of early signs of the mental illness that would affect the rest of the family, in the mid-30s, he completed a suicide. And my father, unfortunately, as a teenager, had to find him and cut him down. Despite this disaster, the family and what were then 6 siblings stuck together with my grandmother and managed to successfully continue farming until World War II, when they, like all the other Japanese in California, were put in concentration camps as enemy aliens. These events were thought to have been the original source of the stressors that led to mental illness in 4 of these children, severe bipolar illness in 4 of these children. But it has since become clear that it wasn't just that. It was likely to be a genetic disease, because several other members of the family have since developed bipolar illness. Some of my aunts and would disappear for periods of time, and we were told they were on vacation or visiting someone when they were actually hospitalized. And the first time I had a serious discussion about this was after my father had a severe bipolar episode and had to return from a sabbatical in Japan to be treated in San Francisco. I was asked to come and help out my mother while he was undergoing treatment. Then I was finally told about the history of the family, about my grandfather's suicide, and how it's affected other sisters within the group. Despite the fact that many individuals end up hospitalized or in jail and have their lives completely wrecked by these diseases, the family stuck together. 4 of the children went on to complete college. My father went on to complete a PhD. And even after he started having manic depressive episodes, my father was able to become a full professor of economics at Columbia University. Similarly, his sisters, who also developed the disease, were in their own ways able to achieve, make accomplishments. One was a pathologist and one was a teacher. The mutual support in the family has been absolutely critical and has been seen by everyone as the key to the family's success. Having this kind of problem motivates you, and I also makes you more sympathetic to others who, because you can understand why they may be struggling. The difference in outcomes for us in having mental illnesses successfully treated has meant our whole family has been able to succeed in a terrific way. And we can make significant contributions to our society.
All right. So I showed that clip because, you know, while mental illness is not part of this talk, dealing with the stress, you know, recognizing that COVID-19 is going to make us more vulnerable as a community. There is a significant mental health toll right now of COVID-19. And I'm so grateful for Michelle Obama, who recently talked about, you know, her experience of low-grade depression, you know, and related to sheltering in place, related to the racism pandemic. And so epidemics and large-scale disasters equals mental health consequences. So it's quite common for things like depression, PTSD, substance abuse, domestic violence, child abuse to increase in these kinds of times. And the WHO said a massive increase in mental health conditions in the coming months are likely due to the anxiety of the unknown and the isolation. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I learned, and I thought this was really helpful. I heard it in the psychological community first. It was so popular to call it, so it still is, to call it social distancing, but psychologists really started calling it physical distancing because our social needs are so great. And so rather than socially distancing, is there a way that we can physically distance, be safe, but also make sure that we acknowledge our social needs as social beings? So right now, 36.5% of adults in the US are dealing with anxiety or depression since the pandemic, which is up from 11% in 2019. And prescription drugs have had a sharp increase in March, but they have steadied. And then, gotta move this so I can see it. 13% or 3 million kids are receiving mental health care in schools, and 35% receive mental health care exclusively from their school. And we have to remember that all those kids are now sheltering at home, you know, many of whom are not receiving services. So getting help. I think getting help is really critical. If you recognize someone in your family or a friend who seems like they're struggling, really just talking about it openly, I think, is the best way to approach it. A lot of times we are so afraid to confront, you know, the reality of a situation, but I think if we do it with a lot of compassion and express our care for the person, speaking directly is best. So we talked about some of these things to look out for in our loved ones: sudden changes in eating, sleep, affect. Affect is feelings, you know, their emotions. If you notice, you know, big changes in how they express their feelings, emotions, concentration, impulsivity, or personal care. You know, I mean, personal care has been affected a lot in this pandemic. You know, a lot of people talk about the Zoom outfit, you know, sort of the waist up or maybe even the neck up. But what we're talking about here is really some pretty big dips in personal care when someone really is not taking care of themselves in pretty significant ways. And then if you notice, you know, symptoms like hopelessness, guilt, sadness, irritability, poor self-image, withdrawing from friends and family. Well, again, this is a hard one to figure out because we're sheltering in place, and so we're all kind of withdrawn in some ways. But, you know, I think if we notice that people are really holed up, not talking to anyone, really not having much contact, those are, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean something is wrong, but I do think it means we stay alert to figure out what that means. Physical complaints in some communities, including the Japanese American community, can be a symptom of, you know, psychological distress. So for a lot of people, we express our distress in physical complaints. So it might not be, I'm sad, but it might look like I have a stomach ache or I have a headache. Yeah, so we talked about communicating openly and directly, compassion and reaching out. We all go through hard times. I think, this is a great thing that we can teach our kids, that it's quite normal in life to go through hard times, and it's okay to ask for help, that we're all here to help each other, and it's okay to get help outside the family or outside the community too. Okay, the most critical thing as we try to care for our families and friends is our own self-care. So this isn't me doing yoga or anything, but I do like yoga. And so that is my favorite kind of self-care. Body and movement, exercise, a physically distanced walk with friends, really important. Following a schedule, just making sure our bodies are kind of getting up around the same time, going to bed around the same time. Everything's a little off for everybody in the pandemic. A lot of people are staying up late, getting up late. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I think part of it is just really recognizing that some routine is very helpful for us. Sleep hygiene. Sleep hygiene refers to how we approach sleep. So for some people, when they're stressed, insomnia or trouble sleeping or trouble staying asleep becomes an issue. And so sleep hygiene refers to our ability to really try to, do some things that really relax us, rather than expecting, okay, I've turned off my computer, my laptop, my iPhone, my, whatever tablet device we have, and now I'm ready to go to sleep. For a lot of people, their bodies don't work that way. Bodies need some time, some downtime. And so sleep hygiene refers to sort of following some regular schedules, and also giving our bodies and minds some space before we fall asleep from things that are activating, things like our devices. Of course, caffeine and alcohol have an effect on some people more than others, but something to watch out for. So I'm just going to see if I'm heading in the right direction here. Okay, I'm doing okay, I think. So I'm wondering if in the chat, I'm going to put another question in for everybody. So just wondering what everyone's favorite form of self-care is. What you do to relax, take care of yourself. Feel free to think about it and put something in the chat box. Okay, great. Meditate, qigong, go outside for a walk, running, exercise, sewing projects. Okay, it says here, John Zhang raised a hand. I'm not sure how to call on you. I don't know if Ali or Haruka can help with that. I see photography. Ignore the raised hand. Okay. Anyone else? Those are great. Watching Netflix. Great. Making new recipes. Wonderful. That's great. I think knowing what we go to, that it's not just something we enjoy doing, but that our hobbies or things that we find relaxing are actually quite critical to our well-being. So it's not just sort of this side thing that we do. It should really be sort of something that we think of as something that we need, that's central in our lives, because it's so important for everything else that we do. So, caring for our friends and families requires that we ourselves are in a healthy and good place, or healthy and good enough place. We also can get affected. Okay, I'm going to keep going here. So we were just talking about sleep and the need for structure. So some people like structure more than others, and so I don't think it's about changing people's personalities or temperaments to, sort of have to do it a certain way. But I do think that in these kinds of times, it's easy for, especially if you used to commute to work and all of a sudden you don't need to do that, or you used to, pick up your mother at this time. If all those things have been changed or altered or aren't happening, it's easy for our schedules to get thrown off. And so structure is actually very helpful for us as human beings. So again, it doesn't have to be a rigid structure, but how do we make some of these distinctions and boundaries around work and play? So a common thing that I'm hearing about is, we're working in our homes, but all of a sudden our homes are now having to be our offices, our gyms, our social, our restaurants, and, our homes where we are, we're lucky enough to have a home, lucky enough to have a roof over our heads. And yet these places are, not always defined now in terms of what happens. And so some structure and ritual is great. Meal times as well, so depending on whether you live alone or you live with other people, just having some structure around meal times. Again, doesn't have to be rigid, doesn't have to be exactly at the same time, but I think having some structure and maybe creating some new rituals, right? So sometimes our old rituals are gone. So, maybe it used to be that on your way, into work, you would, stop by to, I don't know, get a coffee or tea or bagel or, and so now we don't have that commute, or it might be a different commute, or, and so all these changes, what new rituals can we keep? So I just added a silly thing that I did. I had a dog birthday party. It was only about 30 minutes, but it was just a little fun thing that we did for a tiny bit of time. So just one idea about something silly. I think using humor is really great. Just having a little lightness, a little levity, a little fun can be great, especially since there's so much seriousness to some of the things that are going on. So helping our friends and family find community and social support is critical. So we know from the social science literature that social support, it sounds kind of common sense, like, yeah, social support sounds great. We actually know from the empirical literature that social support is an excellent way to manage things like depression. And so the more social supports we have, the less isolated we are, the more we are to feel a sense of wellness. And so, again, physical distancing, not social distancing. We really need our community. And so we have to figure out all new ways to do these things. So if we used to see our friends at the gym, if we used to see our friends on the way to BART, if we used to see our friends, at school, work, those things are all altered. And so finding and being intentional, right? Because I've been thinking about how even if you had a job and you're not going into your job right now, the little comments, the water cooler talk, if you will, those things aren't happening. And yet it's awkward to kind of schedule a water cooler talk, right? But I think thinking about who do we enjoy, who helps us feel at ease in our lives, who are the friendships that we really care about, who are the people in our families that we really want to make sure we nurture and nourish the connection with, choosing those people and really making sure that we put some intention to seeing those individuals. Okay, meditation. So this is another silly photo of my dog. And meditation is something that you may like, you may not like, you may have tried it, you may not have tried it. In many traditions around the world, as well as many religious traditions around the world, you do not have to be religious, but certainly some spiritual and religious traditions have meditation as part of their practice. And meditation is also something that in the social sciences, there's a lot of literature, a lot of empirical support for how meditation can be helpful in managing things like anxiety. And anxiety is something there's an abundance of right now during COVID. And so you might recognize it in yourself, you might recognize it in your loved ones. And so part of it is, how do we all, because most of us feel some level of anxiety or stress, if you will. And so part of it becomes, how do we manage that? And so we're all going to have some different tools or strategies, coping skills. And for some people, meditation is a really great way to down-regulate our system. So it's just something, you know, there's all sorts of apps and things online, but if it's something that you've been curious about, you know, maybe it's something that you can do, even try with your loved ones. There's also a lot of literature on nature and the healing power of nature. And so getting out is really important, and being in nature is a really great, healthy, and safe way to be with other people right now. Okay. So sometimes, you know, helping, even in times of stress, even in times like a pandemic, sometimes when we're feeling down, something that helps some people is helping other people, right? Sometimes having a goal larger than ourselves is very, very helpful in feeling good about ourselves. And so for those of you who are so inclined, you know, I think volunteering or helping, you know, it doesn't have to be a formal thing. It can just be, you know, getting a gallon of milk for the neighbor, or bringing some flour or rice to somebody. Sometimes something small like that can really uplift ourselves as well. So encouraging our family and friends to also do that, you know, reaching out to other people. Okay, I think this is my last slide here, and I think I've made it pretty much on time. Self-compassion. I really wanted to close with self-compassion because I think these are some really challenging and hard times. I think one of the hardest things for a lot of people is not knowing, you know, not knowing what the future will bring, and holding that uncertainty with a lot of compassion, holding our own stress or overwhelm with compassion. And also, I think that helps us be more compassionate with other people. And for some of you, you might recognize that sometimes it's easier to be compassionate with other people than it is with yourself. And this is a little saying that my yoga teacher says, and I just find it very reassuring in some ways. May you be happy and peaceful, safe and protected from inner and outer harm. May you be healthy and strong and free in your body, in your mind, and in your heart. And may you accept yourself just as you are. So really just caring for ourselves in this deep way really helps us also care for the community, for our friends and family. And I guess I'll just say in closing, one of the most beautiful things that I heard somebody say, an African-American colleague that I work with at the Wright Institute said, when this all started to happen, we don't need hope, we just need each other. And so I thought that's a beautiful way to kind of think about how we can help our family and friends. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my slide deck here, and then I will have Ali and Haruka help me here with this next step, I think. Good question. I really think people are struggling with that, right? You know, I mean, I have, you know, lots of silly examples that come to mind, you know, where people, it's like, you know, I had a friend tell me yesterday, another psychologist friend who says, well, you know, the beginning of the pandemic, I started out, you know, mostly trying to be professional. It was, you know, I was wearing stretch pants, but, you know, I was still really dressed. And then now, you know, I'm barely in anything appropriate underneath. And it's sort of a silly story, but I think, you know, one that a lot of us are dealing with in terms of just, you know, now if you are lucky enough to be at home, that means you don't have a commute. And so it's like, well, you know, you could technically wake up 5 minutes before your meeting. But I think part of it is also that going back to that structure and ritual, and also talking with the people in your family about what's working and what's not working, right? Because I think it really depends on who you're living with too. Because I think that interaction between people can also affect how that goes in terms of, you know, how you're sharing space or how often you see each other or how often you don't see, some people report to me things like, you know, we see each other all the time because we're in the same space trying to do, you know, you're on a meeting over here, you're in school over here, and I'm here trying to do my thing, and we're all kind of in the same space. And then other people I've heard say, you know, they're just kind of locked up in their room doing their thing all day. So I think there's a real range, but I think, is there a way that we can set some rituals or expectations? And I guess I wonder, you know, I don't have all the expertise in the room too, so I just wonder if there are other people who have tried certain things that have worked well for them. I imagine, you know, over the 5+ months that we've been doing this now, some people have tried different things and have had different results. So I wonder if anyone else has anything to contribute too. I hope that begins to answer your question, how to go, you know.
Sure.
Yeah. I know, you know, I don't know if any of you have tried sort of online exercising. I think probably some of you have. And I think, to me, that's the closest way to approximate sort of doing things in community. And so I know that I've come to rely on that. You know, I have sort of a community that I see regularly. And so for me, that accountability helps. Like, if I'm not there, someone's going to go, oh, where were you? Or, oh, I saw you last week, but I didn't see you this week. So sometimes that's helpful. And that's, you know, a form of sort of structure. Yeah, a form of ritualizing something in my week. I think sometimes we also just need a few anchors in the day, you know, to kind of know, like, well, you know, there's work, but there's also like these things throughout my day that sort of anchor my day. So, you know, even if it's like, I don't know, I'm going to take a 15-minute drive to see the Bay, you know, for those of us who live, you know, in the Bay Area, it's like, if we can, you know, you don't even have to take a big hike or anything like that, but maybe that's something that, you know, becomes your Friday night ritual, who knows? But sometimes even small things, you know, like, you know what, I'm going to make, you know, I've heard some people say, you know what, I sort of have this ritual around how I make my tea or coffee. And this is sort of like the steps that I do. And it might seem small, but sometimes those things bring comfort and regularity to our day. Yeah, we're so even more reliant. I mean, we were a screen society before the pandemic, and now it's very intense, right? We're on these devices all the time, and we're reliant on them for everything from doing work and school, but also even like medical appointments. If you're doing, you know, virtual telehealth appointments, as well as social, right? We see our friends, they want to have a Zoom, or you know, family members might do like a little Zoom reunion. So the sleep hygiene thing, you know, there's a lot of resources online. So if you actually look up sleep hygiene, you'll find a lot of stuff on it. But I think it goes back to just making sure, you know, I don't know what the optimal amount of time is, but a lot of times there are recommendations for around 2 hours. For some people, that sounds like, you know, stay away 24 hours before you go to bed. So, you know, but I think trying something a little bit out of our comfort zone, especially if we're noticing that our sleep is really off. And this is really common. I mean, I think it's kind of epidemic right now, this, you know, sleep stuff. I've heard it from a lot of different people. And so just really, I think a lot of times we're not intentional too. So I don't know if this happens to you, but I know I find myself sort of I get dragged into it, and then I don't even realize that I've sort of been on my device for all this time. I've sort of gone down the rabbit hole of, you know, reading something or looking for something, or but oftentimes it's not critical for me to be doing that. And so I think just bringing some intention to, you know what, I think I'm going to just turn off my devices at this time. And that's, you know, it's going to look different for everybody. And I don't think there's no judgment about it. But I think if you're having trouble falling asleep, turning off the devices is definitely up there in terms of sleep hygiene. And then I think, you know, really noticing, you know, like alcohol and drugs. So, you know, any substances that we take in, but also things like caffeine caffeine and alcohol can really interrupt and affect our sleep. So just noticing some people's bodies are different than others. You know, some people can have an espresso at 7 o'clock at night. I am not one of those people. I have a hard time having that at 7 a.m. and going to sleep at night. So it depends on who you are. Question. We're in such strange and unusual times. I've heard of people having caregivers at the institution turn on the device so that you can connect virtually. I don't know if that's an option, but if that is an option, I think sometimes that's helpful, because just logging on sometimes is more than half the battle. And so if there can be some support around that, can be great to be connected virtually. It's not nearly as good as being in person, but yeah, the technology is great, but it's not great if people can't access it. Yeah. Anyone else have other ideas about that, or things they've tried with family members to be in touch?
I know I've been connecting with some of the seniors in our community, and just like a simple phone call and just like chatting with them has been really helpful. And I just like ask them out, like, oh, what'd you do this week? Or like, and then also try to push them to like, maybe like, hey, if you want to try Zoom, I can walk you through it and like step by step how to do it, kind of thing. And one of the people I reached out to, she actually has a caption reader to like help with the hearing. So when you call, they can like read while you're talking, which has been really helpful. But yeah, now I'm like sending letters and trying to do like handwritten snail mail stuff. So that's definitely things I've been doing.
That's great. Yeah, I think telephone technology is so much easier for a lot of older, adults. It's just more familiar than, virtual technology. So I think, telephone is great. I mean, I think it's so nice to be able to see somebody's face and expressions. That's such a beautiful part of how we feel connected to each other. But, telephone used to be the mode of communication not so long ago. So yeah, for a lot of older people, the phone is great. But I think if your older family members are not wanting to kind of get together because, it feels risky, I've heard of people doing sort of visits even just from their cars. So, just even, you don't even have to get out of the car. You can like drive up in your car and just roll down the windows and have a visit, from someone's front door or porch. So I've heard of, visits like that as well. So that, that can be an option, not if you're in a facility, but for some older adults, I think that's a comfortable way to connect.
Yeah, and kind of going off that, I know just dropping off like little like activities or stuff. I know the center has been dropping off puzzles. I think we've been dropping off some like boxes of movies to one of our relatives too. So just like little activities they can do as well.
It's such a good question, and I'm hearing a lot about that, intergenerational differences in terms of values. And, I've talked to, people in my community and in my practice about, what's happening with teenagers. And I think there's a lot of differences, a lot of diversity among teenagers as well. I think it's a good question about how to, work with teenagers who are trying to do the right thing, right? Trying to do all these right things. And yet there's sort of this subtle pressure maybe from friends. I just wonder if there are other people who have any experience with this. I think part of it is also just talking as openly as we can, right? I mean, this is not different from a lot of other social pressures in some ways. There's a lot of pressure, peer pressure to do a lot of things. And how do we deal with peer pressure, period? This is just a new form of peer pressure, but it's just kind of in a different package, but it's really the same kind of thing. And, teenage years are when a lot of people are forming their identities, really discovering their values. And so I think talking to kids about, what are their values? And, it's kind of like when someone pressures you to do something, are they a good friend? Talking to kids about that, I think is just helps to normalize that kind of situation rather than sort of feeling like they have to take on the burden of that pressure. It's like, well, maybe they don't have to sort of tackle that on their own, right? That they can talk about it and think about it. And also maybe there are also allies in the community, other kids who may also feel differently. Maybe they notice other kids who they might be able to connect with that maybe have more similar values. Anyone else? Love it. You were going to suggest that the teen can set up online social gatherings, like kids that they feel more of a kinship with, or, just selecting their own friends. Fun games to play online with friends. I love it. Great ideas. Really leveraging technology too. These are great suggestions. And I love the suggestion about, I love the interns who created the YouTube video on how to access Zoom. I really needed that a few months ago when I was trying to help my own parents get on Zoom. Great. Board games are Ariana? The center staff just played Drawwise together, and it was really fun. Also do a craft synchronously. Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of things that are happening. I mean, I think despite the challenges and the stress, there are also some really cool creative things that I think have come out of being forced to do more stuff online. And so I know, people have had all sorts of parties online, I know someone in my family has attended a pizza making party online, so get together with all your friends and make a pizza together, and then eat it together at the end. Yeah. We have a few more minutes. Other questions? I want to make sure that if you came with, a burning question, that we get to it. I think checking out your insurance benefits is great. A lot of people like the app Calm. I don't work for Calm. I've used it maybe once, but some people really love that app for meditation. There's a ton of stuff on, online too, that's available for free. A lot of people like the work of Tara Brach and her meditation. I think it's interesting to think about who leads these meditations and things like that. A lot of times, the yoga and the meditation work that I've done have been largely white spaces. And so I know that I was talking to one of my friends recently, and she's found this yoga community that they're gathering virtually for this training, and it's all people of color. So there's some really cool things like that that are happening that I'm really very, very excited about as well. So I think, you know, it's wonderful to see things move in a more inclusive direction. Just beautiful to see. That's a really hard one, and one that I've encountered a lot, both in my sort of personal community of people I know and also in my practice. That question of what do you do with the people who, you know, it's one thing, you know, when someone in public, you can sort of, you know, you likely won't see that person again. But if they're in your family or if they're in your close circle of friends, that's been the biggest thing, is sometimes people have very different beliefs about what they consider safe. Or some people feel like, no, it's my right not to wear a mask. That's a really hard one because we can't, the reality is we can't change other people. And I think the hardest question you asked, the hardest part of it was when they're in your own home. That's really hard because then you have nowhere else to go. You can't, you know, but I think, you know, in things like this, a lot of times it's our boundaries, right? How do we create our own boundaries so that we feel safe in the interactions that we're having with people? So, you know, you know, I've heard some people say, you know what, this family member refuses to, you know, wear a mask, or this family member refuses to do this. So I've had to kind of limit my interactions, not because I don't want to see them, but if that's how they are gonna, if that's how they're gonna be, then I need to limit my interaction with them. And that seems pretty healthy, right? Not in terms of, you know, more in terms of taking care of ourselves, right? Taking care of what feels right for us and what feels like a healthy boundary for us, and really just having compassion for what our needs are, right? So, you know, when something doesn't feel right. And I think, you know, I really want to work with people to trust that, right? To trust that if you don't feel right, you have a right to be able to say, no, I don't want to do that. And so asserting our boundaries to say, you know, these are the people. And I think, you know, friendship circles have changed for some people. Like, you know what, these friends aren't doing what I need them to do. And so I'm gonna, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean, okay, they're banished from my life forever, but maybe we choose to see them less, right? Like we think with a lot of intention about, well, you know, I have a certain amount of social time, right? I have a certain amount of time that I can spend with friends. And how am I going to spend that time? Am I going to spend it with, you know, with friends who make me uncomfortable? Or am I going to spend it with people who help, who support me, who I feel like support the values that I have? So the hardest part is when you asked when they're in your house. That's a really rough one because, you know, it might mean, you know, trying to draw those boundaries in one's home, right? So right now in, you know, in California, we can be outside, and that's a really beautiful thing. That's about to change though, right? I mean, it doesn't get that cold, but it gets colder in the winter, it gets rainier, it gets harder to be outside.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think a lot of times people think of self-care kinds of things as luxuries. And it's often the first thing for some people that goes when they're stressed, like, oh, I have a work deadline, I'm not going to be able to work out. Or, oh, I have, you know, this to do, I'm not going to see my friends. And, you know, I think we don't want to be rigid. Sometimes we need to do that, right? Sometimes we just need to not see our friends or not exercise because we need to get something done. But I think if we do that consistently, it's really a disservice to ourselves, right? Because those are not just things that are like fun things for us to do. They're actually critically necessary for our well-being. And, you know, I know that recently I saw a group of friends that I hadn't seen in this whole pandemic, and it really lifted my spirits to see them and to be able to be in person. And we, you know, we were distanced, but I think really making sure that those things are in our schedules. A lot of times people will schedule work, they'll put it in their calendars, but they don't put in like this is my half hour or hour to do something relaxing, whether that's exercising or just chatting with friends or just even reading the paper outside and enjoying the sun, you know, whatever it is that you find nourishing and relaxing, you know, if we can just schedule those things in along with our deadlines or other things we have to do, I think that's a really good step in the right direction in caring for ourselves. It's a really great question. And I don't know that I have like the panacea for our adjustment to life after COVID, but I do think, some things will probably not change back, you know? So I think, you know, I think one of the hardest things is accepting reality as it is. And so I think that's what we're all dealing with, is we keep waiting for something else to change. And it's hard to kind of settle into this moment and the reality of what we're dealing with. So I relate, you know, as a human being to that condition of feeling a little bit like, okay, you know, when are we going to be done with this? You know, in terms of transition, yeah, you know, one of the thoughts I had, a couple things came to mind. One, I thought, again, for those of us who are lucky enough to be at home, I think a commute is going to be a shock to the system, you know, for me, when I go back to that, because it's been such a luxury not to have that. You know, some people have also talked about all the animals that will be so sad to have their family members away from home for such a long time. But I think, you know, on a more serious note, I think we will all be quite different by that time too, you know? And so I wonder if some of these new traditions that we're developing may stick. You know, I think that some forms of conferences, you know, and classes online will stay that way, because in some ways there are some benefits to that. So, you know, I can't peer into the future to imagine what that transition will be like, but I do think that, you know, in the work that I do in psychotherapy, I think a lot of it is also just, there's a lot of anxiety in thinking about the future. And some, you know, some of you may have heard of this, but sometimes we call that future tripping, because it's, you know, it's sort of anxious, you know, we have a lot of anxiety about being here. And so we sort of do this where we sort of think about the future or remember the past, and instead of sort of staying with ourselves in this moment. So, but I think we're all doing it. We're all wondering what the future will be like. I certainly do. And, you know, and I think part of it is some of these new traditions, I think we're going to enjoy the changes that we've made over time. And so we'll probably know what's right, you know, when it comes. But I don't think my training has not prepared me to answer that question, is what I can say. But it's a very good question. And I think we're all about to have a big social experiment where we find out what that transition is going to be like.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So if there are no other questions, I want to be conscious of everyone's time. So I'm just going to say thank you to everyone for a wonderful discussion and Q&A session. And on behalf of the center, we thank everyone for coming out tonight to engage in this important discussion in these uncertain times. I also would like everyone to put their hands together, our virtual hands together, to thank Dr. Yokoyama, our presenter, who made a wonderful presentation for us today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. It was such a pleasure, and so glad that we could gather. And please let me know if you have any other questions.